Millions watched as Karoline Leavitt, usually confident, usually defiant, did something no one ever expected. She begged. On live television, before an audience that stretched from Capitol Hill to living rooms across America, the once unflinching mouthpiece of right-wing bravado looked small, desperate, cornered. Her voice, once sharp and weaponized, now trembled as she uttered the words no one could believe: "Please, drop the lawsuit." The lawsuit she spoke of wasn't a petty claim, not a political stunt easily brushed aside. It was an $80 million thunderbolt, a legal strike that carried weight, power, and consequences so massive it threatened to unravel the very empire she and her allies had built. The number itself, 80 million, hung in the air like a death sentence. It wasn't just dollars, it was dignity, accountability, and justice demanding their due. Cameras zoomed in on Leavitt's face. The cracks showed. For years she had thrived on confrontation, spinning outrage into applause. But this time, her words didn't land with force, they fell like confessions. Viewers could sense it, the sudden collapse of arrogance, the uneasy shift from attacker to supplicant. This wasn't the firebrand persona her supporters adored. This was a politician staring into the abyss of her own downfall. Across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Calm, unflinching, unreadable. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice or lean forward. Her silence was louder than Leavitt's pleading. Her stillness carried more weight than the avalanche of excuses pouring from the other side of the table. In that silence, millions of viewers leaned closer to their screens, waiting for the storm they knew was coming. What happens when arrogance meets accountability? When the loudest voice in the room realizes volume cannot erase truth. The tension built with every second Leavitt filled with her own fear. She begged, she justified, she appealed to sympathy, but Crockett's eyes never softened. And then came the moment. The one that would define not just this debate, but the balance of dignity and division in America's political stage. Leavitt's final plea hung in the air. But the way Jasmine Crockett answered left the room frozen. The number alone was staggering, $80 million. But this lawsuit was never just about the money. To Karoline Leavitt, it was about survival. To Jasmine Crockett, it was about justice. And to the millions watching, it was about what happens when unchecked arrogance finally meets a wall it cannot crash through. $80 million is more than most Americans will ever see in a lifetime. But for a political figure like Leavitt, the lawsuit was far greater than financial ruin. It was the public stripping away of a reputation she had carefully manufactured. It was the shattering of the illusion of invincibility. If Crockett's case prevailed, it wouldn't just bankrupt Leavitt's political future, it would brand her name with a scarlet letter that could never be erased. This wasn't a backroom settlement or a quiet reprimand. This was a battlefield, played out under glaring lights, with the nation as witness. And Leavitt knew it. That's why her voice cracked, why her tone shifted from firebrand combativeness to a hollow plea. Because here's the truth, when Crockett filed that $80 million claim, she wasn't just demanding compensation. She was demanding accountability for years of attacks, for rhetoric laced with venom, for the kind of politics that treats truth like a disposable toy. To Crockett, this was about legacy, about proving that power doesn't mean impunity, and that even the loudest voice can be called to answer. Leavitt, on the other hand, saw her empire trembling. The lawsuit wasn't simply a legal threat, it was humiliation made tangible. For someone who built her persona on strength, on dominance, on the relentless projection of certainty, there was nothing more terrifying than this exposure of weakness. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law, it was a stage where her enemies, her critics, and even her former allies would watch her stripped of control. And so she begged. Because she understood something her supporters could not yet see, Crockett didn't need the money. Crockett wanted the truth out loud, documented, undeniable. She wanted the record to show who Karoline Leavitt really was when the bluster faded. This wasn't just about dollars, the commentators whispered as the clip spread across social media like wildfire. This was about humiliation. And humiliation is the one currency politicians cannot survive. That was why Leavitt's desperation felt so raw. She wasn't fighting over numbers in a bank account, she was fighting over the story history would tell about her. Would she be remembered as the fighter who outlasted every storm, or the fraud who collapsed under pressure? But if Leavitt thought Crockett would be swayed by pleas of pity, she had miscalculated. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to political warfare. She had stared down smear campaigns, stood her ground in hearings designed to silence her, and carried herself with the unshakable knowledge that representation matters more than intimidation. For Crockett, bending now would mean erasing the very principles that got her here. And so, when Leavitt's voice cracked, when she leaned forward and uttered the unthinkable, "Please, drop the lawsuit," the nation held its breath. They knew Crockett's response wouldn't come cheap. Because this wasn't just Leavitt's moment of desperation. It was Crockett's moment to decide how history would remember her, as the woman who stood firm in the face of power, or the one who folded when the begging began. And the silence that followed was louder than any plea. The stillness was charged with the weight of something final, something irreversible. The room waited for Jasmine Crockett to speak. And when she did, the world would not forget. Karoline Leavitt did not stumble into the spotlight, she carved her way into it with sharpened elbows and an unshakable swagger. From the moment she first appeared on the national stage, she branded herself as the fighter, the warrior who never flinched. Young, brash, unapologetically conservative, she carried herself like a storm. Every sound bite, every interview, every confrontation was laced with bravado. To her supporters, she was fire incarnate. To her critics, she was arrogance personified. Her rise was meteoric. In an era where polished restraint was often mistaken for weakness, Leavitt's unfiltered aggression became her signature weapon. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed she could bend the truth into whatever shape she needed. She leaned into the spectacle of confrontation, thriving on the viral clip, the trending hashtag, the headline that cast her as the unshakable provocateur. For years, she built her reputation by ridiculing opponents, mocking their identities, dismissing their pain. She had no hesitation in branding others as soft, weak, or unfit when they showed even a flicker of vulnerability. To Leavitt, compassion was weakness, and weakness had no place in politics. Her political swagger was both armor and sword, a way to shield herself from scrutiny while slashing at anyone who dared challenge her. And it worked. Cameras followed her. Talk shows booked her. Donors poured money into her campaigns. She was young enough to be painted as the future, aggressive enough to embody the fight, and brazen enough to embrace the villain role that others tried to avoid. But with every rise comes shadows. And Leavitt's career carried plenty of them. There were the controversies, the fiery speeches that courted outrage, the reckless comments that blurred the line between rhetoric and cruelty. There were moments when her words ignited not just debate but anger, real-world backlash, and fear among those who felt targeted. Time and again, she doubled down. To her base, this was proof of strength. To her opponents, it was proof of recklessness. Yet, beneath the armor, cracks began to show. A whisper here, a slip there, signs that the invincible image she projected was not as unbreakable as it seemed. For years, Leavitt thrived on the humiliation of others, but the cruel irony was that her own empire would eventually face the same weapon turned against her. The lawsuit from Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a legal document, it was a mirror. It forced Leavitt to confront the very tactics she had spent a career wielding. Every time she had mocked someone's struggle, every time she had reduced pain to a punchline, every time she had painted herself as untouchable, all of it now returned with a vengeance. That is why her plea to Crockett shocked the nation. Because the Karoline Leavitt who begged was not the Leavitt people knew. This was the woman who had sneered at compromise, who had dismissed diplomacy as cowardice. This was the politician who built her brand on never backing down. And yet, in front of millions, she folded her hands, bent her voice, and asked for mercy. The hypocrisy was glaring. Here was a woman who, for years, had condemned others for showing fragility, now brought to her knees by her own. Here was the so-called warrior, stripped of her armor, revealing the humanity she had so long denied others. The bravado that once seemed unshakable evaporated in the face of consequence. And the public noticed. Critics pounced, replaying clips of her past mockery side by side with her trembling plea. Commentators labeled it the collapse of the Leavitt myth. On social media, the hashtags trended with merciless speed, hashtag begging Leavitt, hashtag from swagger to silence. The contrast was too rich, the irony too heavy to ignore. For years, Karoline Leavitt had been the villain in the eyes of many, bold, ruthless, untouchable. But villains are never invincible. And in this moment, America witnessed what happens when the character you've built collides with the reality you can no longer control. Because the truth is, toughness is not tested in easy victories. It is tested when the tide turns against you, when the very stage that once amplified your strength now magnifies your weakness. And in that test, Karoline Leavitt cracked. Her rise had been defined by control of her image, her narrative, her dominance over every exchange. But now, that control was gone. She could no longer dictate the story. The lawsuit had wrested it from her hands and handed it to Jasmine Crockett, who now held the power to decide whether Leavitt's legacy would be one of triumph or disgrace. And so the once brash fighter, the self-styled warrior, the woman who reveled in others' downfall, now found herself in the very position she had always ridiculed, vulnerable, exposed, desperate. But weakness in politics never goes unpunished. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin in the marble halls of Congress or under the bright lights of television cameras. It begins in the everyday struggles of a working-class family, where grit was a necessity, not an option. She grew up in an America that promised equality but rarely delivered it, especially to those who looked like her or came from her background. From an early age, Jasmine understood what it meant to fight, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She wasn't handed opportunity. She created it. Raised with a sense of justice that came not from textbooks but from lived experience, Crockett's earliest battles were about survival, dignity, and proving that her voice mattered. The injustices she witnessed, in her neighborhood, in her schools, in her own life, planted a seed. She knew the system was often tilted against ordinary people, and she vowed that if she ever had the chance, she would tilt it back toward fairness. That vow carried her through law school, where she quickly became known not just for her sharp intellect but for her relentless advocacy. She didn't study the law as an abstract set of rules. She studied it as a weapon, one she could wield on behalf of those who had none. She built her reputation as a civil rights attorney, representing clients who had been silenced, dismissed, or crushed by institutions that believed they were untouchable. Her courtroom demeanor was legendary, calm, precise, devastating. She didn't need to shout to win, she needed only the truth. That calm strength became her signature. When she stepped into politics, many underestimated her. Some assumed she was too soft-spoken, others doubted she could handle the relentless pressure of the political arena. But Crockett thrived. She won not by out-yelling her opponents but by outlasting them. Where others erupted in anger, she stayed grounded. Where others deflected, she dissected. It wasn't just her words that carried weight, it was her presence. People leaned in when she spoke, because they knew she wasn't wasting time with theatrics. She was delivering clarity. Her rise wasn't fueled by billion-dollar donors or a machinery of consultants. It was fueled by communities who saw in her someone who carried their struggles with dignity. Teachers, nurses, single parents, small business owners, they recognized that Crockett wasn't a politician dressing herself in borrowed stories. She was one of them. She lived it. And she carried their voices into every chamber she entered. Still, the road wasn't smooth. Like anyone who dares to speak truth to power, she faced relentless attacks. She was called names, caricatured, targeted with smears meant to shake her composure. But Crockett's resilience was forged in fire long before the cameras ever found her. She had already learned how to stand tall when the ground shifted beneath her. That resilience earned her a reputation, not just among supporters but even grudgingly among her rivals. Unshakable became the word most often used to describe her. Where others lost their temper or cracked under pressure, she seemed to grow stronger. It was as if every attempt to rattle her only proved how immovable she truly was. And perhaps that's why the showdown with Karoline Leavitt struck such a chord. On one side was Leavitt, the brash, self-styled warrior whose career had been built on aggression. On the other was Crockett, calm, steady, composed, the woman whose strength came not from shouting down others but from never being shaken herself. The $80 million lawsuit represented more than money. For Crockett, it represented the fight she had promised her constituents, that no one, no matter how loud or powerful, was above accountability. She wasn't driven by spite, she was driven by principle. She understood that this wasn't just about her. It was about a system in which too many had been silenced while bullies thrived. And when the moment came, when Leavitt shocked the nation by begging for the lawsuit to be dropped, Crockett didn't gloat, didn't erupt, didn't lose her footing. She did what she had always done, she remained calm. Her reaction, described by some as cold and by others as righteous, wasn't born of cruelty. It was born of conviction. Crockett knew what was at stake. To waver now, to bend to theatrics, would be to betray every principle she had carried since the beginning. Her composure that night wasn't just a performance, it was the culmination of her entire journey. The little girl who had grown up watching injustice, the lawyer who had battled for dignity in courtrooms, the congresswoman who had carried herself through firestorms without flinching, all of that came together in this one defining moment. The audience watching felt it too. They weren't just witnessing a legal drama. They were witnessing a moral one. And for those who believed in her, pride swelled. Because Crockett didn't just represent herself that night. She represented the idea that dignity is more powerful than division, that calm strength can outlast empty bravado, and that the truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. That is why the headlines didn't read, "Leavitt begs." They read, "Crockett doesn't bend." Because Jasmine Crockett had once again proven what her supporters already knew, that she is unshakable. And in a political world addicted to chaos, that kind of strength is rare, and unforgettable. And tonight, as millions replayed the footage, as the internet dissected every word and every pause, one truth echoed louder than any plea: Jasmine Crockett had written another chapter in her story of resilience. Calm. Clear. Unshaken. And she proved it again. The studio lights seemed hotter than usual. Cameras hummed quietly, the audience collectively holding its breath. This was supposed to be just another heated political debate, sharp words, pointed exchanges, sound bites for tomorrow's news cycle. But what unfolded was something no one had expected. Karoline Leavitt, the woman who had built her entire brand on never backing down, was suddenly on the ropes. It began with a tremor in her voice. At first, it was subtle, the kind of crack anyone might mistake for fatigue. But as she leaned into her microphone, her tone carried something no one had ever associated with her: desperation. "Congresswoman Crockett," Leavitt began, her hands gripping the podium as if holding it tighter would ground her, "I'm asking you, publicly, right here, right now, to consider withdrawing this lawsuit. $80 million, it isn't just money, it's my career, my future, my family's stability." The words spilled out with a rawness that stunned the room. For years, Leavitt had thrived on projection, on portraying herself as invincible, untouchable, the political brawler who could take any punch and throw back twice as hard. But in that moment, the mask cracked. Viewers at home leaned closer to their screens, hardly believing what they were seeing. Her plea grew more dramatic with every sentence. She painted herself not as the fearless warrior she had always claimed to be, but as a victim staring down ruin. She spoke of sleepless nights, of the toll the lawsuit had already taken, of the humiliation of being dragged through the headlines. "This isn't just about politics anymore," she insisted, her eyes darting toward Crockett. "This is about survival. I'm begging you, please." Gasps rippled through the audience. Reporters' fingers raced across keyboards. Producers in control rooms whispered frantically into headsets. No one could recall the last time a figure like Leavitt, a woman who relished confrontation, had broken down so publicly, and on such a high-profile stage. And then, all attention shifted to Jasmine Crockett. She hadn't moved. Not once during Leavitt's emotional unraveling did Crockett flinch, frown, or shift uncomfortably. She stood perfectly still, her hands folded lightly on the podium, her posture upright but relaxed. Her face was calm, composed, unreadable, a portrait of control under pressure. The contrast was unbearable. On one side of the stage, Leavitt's body language screamed panic, clenched fists, darting eyes, uneven breaths. On the other side, Crockett radiated steadiness, the kind of poise that made silence more powerful than any rebuttal. Every second of that silence stretched like an eternity, the tension in the room tightening with each passing heartbeat. The cameras cut back and forth, Leavitt's flushed, desperate face, then Crockett's cool, immovable gaze. To the viewers, it was more than a debate. It was theater. It was a test of will. Leavitt leaned forward again, her voice breaking as she tried to fill the void Crockett left with her silence. "You don't understand what this will do to me," she exclaimed, her plea edging closer to humiliation. 80 million, that's not justice, that's destruction. You could end my entire life with one signature." Still, Crockett did not move. The silence was deafening. It was the kind of silence that forced the audience to confront every contradiction in Leavitt's words, the kind of silence that stripped away the last shreds of her bravado. And the longer Crockett waited, the clearer it became, she wasn't just ignoring the plea. She was letting the world see her opponent unravel in real time. For Leavitt, every second was agony. The woman who once thrived on commanding the stage now seemed to shrink under the weight of her own words. Her desperation, raw, emotional, humiliating, had left her exposed. And Crockett's refusal to even acknowledge it was devastating. The tension reached a breaking point. The audience wasn't just waiting for Crockett to respond. They needed her to. The silence was no longer just silence, it was judgment. It was power. And then, finally, Crockett shifted. Just slightly. She leaned forward, her lips parting, her voice about to break the unbearable quiet. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. And then, Crockett finally opened her mouth. The silence before Jasmine Crockett spoke was louder than any outburst Karoline Leavitt had delivered in her entire career. Cameras zoomed in on her expressionless face, while the audience shifted in their seats, their anticipation a living, breathing thing. For a moment, the debate hall felt less like a political forum and more like a courtroom, one where the jury had already decided the verdict, waiting only for the judge to pronounce it. Crockett leaned forward slowly, her hands still folded neatly before her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her composure was the weapon, and it cut sharper than any shout. "Karoline," she said finally, her tone measured, almost surgical. She let the name linger, as if weighing it against the desperation that had just unfolded. "You've spent years telling the American people you're unbreakable. That you're the fighter, the one who never bends. But tonight, in front of millions, you begged." The room exhaled all at once, gasps, whispers, even the faint rustle of reporters scribbling notes. Leavitt's eyes widened, her lips trembling as if she wanted to interject. But Crockett raised one hand slightly, commanding silence without even looking at her. "This lawsuit," Crockett continued, her voice steady and cold, "is not about money. It's about accountability. $80 million is the measure of damage, not to your bank account, but to the truth you've twisted, the lives you've disrupted, the dignity you've tried to strip away from others. And now, when the consequences arrive at your doorstep, suddenly you want mercy?" Her words landed like hammer strikes, deliberate and inescapable. Each pause she took made the audience lean forward, hungry for the next blow. Leavitt shook her head, her throat tightening, but no words came out. She looked small, shrunken compared to the towering persona she had always projected. Crockett pressed on. "You built your career on arrogance. On belittling others. On laughing at their pain. On calling people weak when they were at their lowest. And now here you are, in the very position you mocked, begging. The audience erupted, gasps mixed with a few murmurs of approval. The moderator raised a hand for order, but Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned back, her gaze still locked on Leavitt. Her voice dropped even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear. Do you know what dignity is, Karoline? It's standing tall when life pushes you down. It's facing the consequences of your actions with courage, not theatrics. Dignity is what America deserves in its leaders. And tonight, what you've shown isn't dignity. It's desperation. A chill swept across the room. The contrast was unbearable, Leavitt trembling, sweating, unraveling, Crockett unshaken, almost regal in her control. Leavitt tried to recover, stammering, "You don't understand, this lawsuit, it's excessive." But Crockett cut her off with a single phrase, delivered like a knife. "No, Karoline. What's excessive is your arrogance." The audience gasped again, louder this time, a wave of reaction rolling across the room. Some clapped. Others murmured. Reporters typed furiously, already knowing they had the headline. Leavitt's face flushed crimson. She opened her mouth again, but no rebuttal came. The confidence she once wielded like a shield had crumbled. Each time she looked toward Crockett, it was as if she were staring into a mirror reflecting all her hypocrisy back at her. And Crockett wasn't done. "You asked me to drop this lawsuit," she said, her tone cooling even further. "To erase accountability. To let you walk away clean after the harm you've caused. You think your tears, your pleading, will make me fold. But let me remind you, justice is not optional. Truth is not negotiable. And dignity is not for sale." The room shook with murmurs again. Some people were nodding, others sat frozen, watching history etch itself in real time. Crockett let the silence hang for a few beats before she delivered the final blow. "So no, Karoline. I will not drop this lawsuit. Because this isn't just about you. It's about every American who has ever been bullied, belittled, or silenced by someone drunk on power. This lawsuit is their voice. And I will not take that away from them." The eruption was immediate. Applause broke through despite the moderator's frantic attempts to restore order. Some audience members stood. The noise of clapping and cheers clashed with the stunned silence of those who couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Leavitt, however, looked destroyed. Her shoulders slumped, her once fiery eyes glassy with defeat. The bravado, the confidence, the swagger, gone. In its place was the image of a politician laid bare, stripped of her armor by a single, devastating counterattack. Crockett, meanwhile, remained composed. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't even break her posture. She simply let the applause wash over her, as though acknowledging that the moment wasn't about her victory, but about the principle she stood for. For the audience, it was cathartic. To see arrogance shattered. To watch someone who had long thrived on intimidation finally face the weight of truth. The empowerment was palpable, a reminder that calm strength could topple bluster, and that dignity always outlasts noise. The cameras panned across the room, capturing faces etched in awe, disbelief, and inspiration. Reporters mouthed to each other, "That's the headline." Viewers at home flooded social media, clips of Crockett's words already going viral, "What's excessive is your arrogance." Leavitt fumbled with her notes, her lips moving as if searching for a comeback. But there was nothing left to say. Her confidence had collapsed under the sheer weight of Crockett's calm demolition. She stood exposed, a villain finally undone by her own hubris. Crockett glanced once more in her direction, her gaze cool and unyielding, before turning back to the moderator. "Shall we continue?" she asked softly, as if nothing monumental had just occurred. The crowd roared again. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just the calm voice in a storm. She was the storm. Her words, her presence, her refusal to bend, it wasn't just a counterattack. It was a declaration. And as the cameras captured the image of Leavitt shrinking beside her, it became clear, this was the moment that would be replayed, quoted, and remembered for years to come. The night had belonged to Jasmine Crockett. And the mic drop had landed. The moment Jasmine Crockett's words hit the air, silence fell like a curtain. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen, but outside that chamber, the world was about to roar. Within minutes, the clip was cut, posted, and shared across platforms like wildfire. Hashtags erupted in every corner of social media, hashtag Crockett clapback, hashtag cold as ice, hashtag 80 million beg. TikTok edits remixed the pause, the stare, and the crushing line that followed. Twitter threads declared it the coldest shutdown of the decade. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were vindicated. For countless people who had grown weary of bluster, arrogance, and political theater, this was the counterpunch they had been waiting for. This wasn't just a clapback, one viral post read, this was a public execution of ego. Another added, Leavitt begged, Crockett blinked, and history was made. Within hours, the numbers told their own story. Tens of millions of views. Trending in multiple countries. Reaction videos piling up with titles like, Watch Crockett Freeze Leavitt in Real Time, and, The Look That Ended the Debate. Memes immortalized the moment, Karoline's outstretched hands photoshopped into pop culture scenes, pleading with Thanos, kneeling before Beyoncé, begging in Game of Thrones. Crockett, meanwhile, was painted in the imagery of an ice queen, stoic and unshakable, her silence more devastating than 100 shouting matches. Commentators wasted no time. Cable news anchors framed it as a masterclass in political composure. Talk show hosts replayed it with mock dramatizations. Progressive pundits declared, Crockett just redefined what power looks like in American politics. Even celebrities jumped in, a Grammy-winning singer tweeting simply, Queen Energy Crown, alongside the clip. But the praise wasn't just about performance. It tapped into something deeper, a hunger for dignity in a political landscape drowning in chaos. Crockett didn't need to yell, didn't need to posture. She proved that calm could be sharper than rage, that silence could be more devastating than noise. In that moment, she wasn't just defending herself, she was defending a principle, that integrity will not kneel, not even for $80 million. Leavitt, meanwhile, became the punchline. Headlines framed her as the candidate who cracked. Late-night comedians replayed her plea with exaggerated voices, asking audiences to imagine the bravado-filled firebrand suddenly reduced to begging. It was brutal, but it was effective, her image of toughness collapsed overnight. The ripple effects reached beyond entertainment. Strategists whispered about shifts in perception. Voters saw a contrast too sharp to ignore, arrogance unraveling on one side, unshakable poise on the other. For Crockett supporters, it was proof of what they had always believed, that she carried herself with a rare kind of strength, the kind that couldn't be bought or broken. For Leavitt's critics, it was a long-awaited unmasking. The story refused to fade. Days later, the clip still circulated, racking up views in the tens of millions. Hashtags stayed in rotation. Opinion pieces dissected every glance, every pause, every syllable. It wasn't just a debate moment anymore. It was a cultural reference point. And the sentiment from viewers was clear, this was bigger than a lawsuit. This was bigger than politics. This was a reminder that calm strength can silence the loudest arrogance. The shockwaves had only just begun. Because while the internet laughed and cheered, behind closed doors, the political machine began to turn. When the dust finally settled, when the hashtags slowed and the pundits moved on to their next shouting match, one truth remained etched into the public memory: Jasmine Crockett hadn't just won a debate. She had redefined the moment. For her, it wasn't about theatrics or spectacle. It wasn't even about humiliating Karoline Leavitt, though that was the headline most people clung to. It was about something much larger, a principle. Crockett reframed the confrontation not as a battle over dollars or lawsuits, but as a testament to truth, dignity, and the unshakable core of accountability. In her post-debate reflections, Crockett was calm, deliberate, almost understated. She didn't gloat. She didn't mock. Instead, she reminded people that $80 million could never outweigh integrity. She framed the confrontation as the ultimate test: if you're willing to bend your principles for money, you've already lost more than you can imagine. That message resonated beyond politics. In living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces, people saw a lesson in composure. They saw that power isn't loud, it doesn't need to scream, to posture, or to beg. True power is still, unbothered, grounded in dignity. And that was the contrast: Leavitt's desperate plea versus Crockett's cold composure. The larger theme became impossible to ignore. Money can purchase airtime, influence, and armies of advisors. But it cannot buy respect. It cannot erase accountability. And it certainly cannot repair the cracks of desperation exposed on live television. Crockett embodied that truth in real time. Observers called it a moral correction. Others called it a reminder. But to many, it felt like a cultural shift, proof that arrogance, no matter how loud, collapses against calm conviction. Crockett hadn't just silenced an opponent. She had given a generation a blueprint for how to face pressure, not with rage, not with fear, but with poise so steady it makes the other side unravel. As the conversation deepened, voices across the spectrum echoed the same conclusion: this wasn't just about an $80 million lawsuit. This was about reputation, about dignity, about the things that cannot be bought, sold, or begged for. Crockett, by refusing to bend, reminded America of a timeless truth: that calm dignity cuts deeper than rage. And in that reminder lay the moral of the entire confrontation: sometimes the most devastating answer is not fury, but composure. Sometimes the sharpest weapon is silence, followed by a sentence spoken without haste, without fear, without apology. Crockett carried that weapon, and with it, she wrote her own chapter in the story of political resilience. By the end of it all, one truth rose above the noise: arrogance fades, money burns, desperation embarrasses, but dignity endures. And so it ended, with Karoline Leavitt begging, an $80 million lawsuit hanging in the air, and Jasmine Crockett delivering the coldest reply of the night. What began as a clash of ego and desperation became something much more: a lesson broadcast to millions. The title wrote itself: Leavitt begged. Crockett stayed calm. And the calm became the headline. This wasn't just political theater. It wasn't just another viral clip for the endless churn of social media. It was clarity, a reminder that arrogance burns itself out, but dignity doesn't flinch. Crockett proved that silence can be sharper than shouting, that poise can dismantle even the most expensive armor of pride. For those watching, the moral couldn't be clearer: when desperation collides with truth, truth always wins. When arrogance collapses, dignity stands taller than ever. That's why this moment will be replayed, quoted, and remembered long after the lawsuit headlines fade. And now, it comes to you. Because this story isn't just about two names on a debate stage. It's about a choice we all face: to live by noise, or to live by principle. To chase power at any cost, or to defend dignity no matter the price. If you believe truth should always stand tall, join us. Subscribe. Share this story. Be part of the movement that refuses to let arrogance define America's future. Because in the end, one side begged, the other stood strong. And history remembers only the one who stood.